In the summer of 1967, the Soviet Union unveiled something at the Moscow Air Show that caused immediate alarm in every Western intelligence agency paying attention. 3 aircraft roared overhead in formation, twin-tailed, enormous, traveling at speeds the announcer claimed exceeded Mach 3. The crowd applauded. The Western observers reached for their notebooks and felt something closer to dread. NATO had no designation for this aircraft yet. They gave it one quickly: the Foxbat. Nobody in the West knew what it was exactly. The specifications being whispered through intelligence channels were extraordinary: an interceptor capable of Mach 3.2, operating above 80,000 feet, armed with missiles that could reach out beyond visual range and destroy anything the Americans could put in the air. Air Force Secretary Robert Seamans publicly described it as possibly the best interceptor in production anywhere in the world. The CIA, working from reconnaissance photographs, radar tracking data, and the thin intelligence available from Soviet sources, built a threat assessment. What they concluded terrified military planners. The Foxbat appeared to outperform every fighter NATO possessed. It could climb to altitude faster than anything in the American inventory. At speed, it was untouchable. The SR-71 Blackbird could outrun it, but the SR-71 was a reconnaissance aircraft, not a fighter. Against an incoming force of Foxbats, NATO's air defense looked inadequate. The fear was specific and tactical. Soviet doctrine in the 1960s and 1970s centered on intercepting NATO's nuclear bombers before they could penetrate Soviet airspace. An interceptor this fast, this high, with radar this powerful, would punch through any bomber formation at will. If those same aircraft could be turned offensive, if the Soviets chose to equip their attack forces with Foxbats, then NATO fighters defending Western Europe had a serious problem. The intelligence assessment drove procurement decisions. The United States Air Force was already deep into a competition to develop a new air superiority fighter. The program was called FX. The original requirements had been written with the MiG-21 in mind, a fast, nimble dogfighter that had humiliated American F-4 Phantoms over Vietnam. But the emergence of the Foxbat raised the bar dramatically. McDonnell Douglas engineers, working on what would become the F-15 Eagle, were told the new aircraft had to be capable of defeating the MiG-25. The Phantom in the sky over Moscow was shaping the future of American aviation. For 9 years, the CIA tried to find out what it was actually dealing with. Radar contacts, overflights of the Middle East by Soviet-operated reconnaissance Foxbats flying too high and too fast for Israeli fighters to intercept, infrared signatures, scraps of technical intelligence. A partial picture built up slowly, but the critical question, what was actually inside that airframe, remained unanswered. Then, on a September morning in 1976, a 29-year-old Soviet lieutenant answered it for them. Lieutenant Viktor Belenko had been flying MiG-25s for 4 years when he decided to defect. He was stationed at Chuguyevka Air Base in the Soviet Far East, roughly 120 miles north of Vladivostok. The base was miserable. Infrastructure was crumbling. Morale had collapsed. When Belenko raised concerns with his superiors, the political officer dismissed him. His wife had filed for divorce and was taking their son to her parents' home in Magadan. After years of dedication to the Soviet Air Defense Forces, a branch considered more prestigious than the regular Air Force, Belenko had concluded that the system was rotten. He had also concluded that the United States government paid substantial rewards to Soviet pilots who defected with their aircraft. The KGB was closing in, Intelligence had reached the base that Belenko's intentions were suspected. He needed to move before they stopped him. On the morning of September 6, 1976, Belenko walked his 4-year-old son to kindergarten. Then he drove to the base, signed out for a routine training sortie, climbed into his MiG-25P, and took off with several other aircraft from the 513th Fighter Regiment. He followed the flight plan for several minutes. Then he descended sharply, dropped below radar coverage, and turned east toward Japan. His intended destination was Chitose Air Base on Hokkaido, a Japanese military installation. The weather over the Sea of Japan was overcast and difficult. Chitose did not appear where his charts indicated. Japan Air Self-Defense Force, F-4 Phantoms, were scrambled to intercept and escort him in, but the cloud cover and the limitations of their radar meant they never found him. Belenko's fuel state was becoming critical. The MiG-25 consumed fuel at a rate that made long-range flight marginal at best. He was burning approximately 35 liters per minute. His gauges were moving toward empty when he spotted something through the clouds below him. Hakodate Airport, a civilian facility on the southern tip of Hokkaido. He circled 3 times, nearly colliding with a Boeing 727 on its approach. He deployed his drag parachute, stood on the brakes, and the MiG-25 still overran the runway by nearly 800 feet, blowing a front tire and stopping just short of a localizer antenna. Civilian passengers at the terminal photographed the enormous Soviet fighter as it came to rest with 2 minutes of fuel remaining. Belenko climbed out of the cockpit, brandishing a pistol and demanding asylum in the United States. He had brought with him the pilot's manual for the MiG-25. He expected to assist American pilots in flying and evaluating his aircraft. He had planned this moment carefully and understood precisely what he was delivering. The Soviet Union responded with immediate fury. They demanded the aircraft and the pilot be returned at once. They insisted Belenko had lost his way. Then they insisted he had been drugged. They seized Japanese fishing vessels and imprisoned their crews in what was widely interpreted as retaliation for Japan's failure to return Belenko immediately. A banner later appeared on the American C-5 Galaxy that transported the partially disassembled MiG from Hakodate to a military airbase. Sorry for the trouble, people of Hakodate. The Soviets, when the aircraft was eventually crated and returned to them, presented Japan with a bill for $10 million in damages. Japan responded with an invoice for $40,000 in airfield damage and crating fees. Neither bill is known to have been paid. Belenko himself was flown to the United States 2 days after landing, on a Northwest Airlines flight from Tokyo. He would be debriefed for 5 months. The aircraft he left behind would tell its own story first. American and Japanese engineers spent 2 months taking the MiG-25P apart at Hyakuri Air Base. What they found overturned nearly a decade of intelligence assessments. The aircraft was not what the CIA had concluded it was. In some respects, it was more sophisticated than expected. In most respects, it was far less. Start with the construction. The West had assumed a Soviet aircraft capable of sustained Mach 3 flight would be built primarily from titanium, the same exotic, expensive, heat-resistant alloy used extensively in the SR-71 Blackbird. It was not. Approximately 80% of the MiG-25's airframe was made from nickel steel, arc-welded. The welds were visible. Rivet heads protruded in places. Soviet manufacturing facilities could not produce titanium in the quantities required for mass production of an interceptor, so engineers had used heavy-grade steel instead. This decision made the aircraft extremely heavy, an empty weight approaching 20,000 kilograms, and it placed severe structural limits on what the airframe could withstand. The MiG-25's maximum sustained G loading was 4.5. With a full fuel load, it dropped to just 2.2. An aircraft built to intercept bombers in a straight line, not to dogfight. The engines were enormous. Two Tumansky R-15 afterburning turbojets, each producing roughly 11,000 kilograms of thrust with afterburner engaged. They were capable of pushing the aircraft to extraordinary speeds, but at a cost. The Foxbat could theoretically reach Mach 3.2. Israeli F-4 Phantoms had tracked Soviet MiG-25 reconnaissance flights over the Sinai in 1973, achieving speeds in that range. But Belenko confirmed what those flights had demonstrated. Pilots who pushed the engines to Mach 3 or beyond destroyed them. Compressor blades burned and failed. The aircraft could sprint at those speeds for a matter of minutes before requiring complete engine replacement. The practical operational limit was Mach 2.8, and even that was hard on the turbines. At Mach 2.5, the aircraft could fly missions with engines surviving long enough to be worth overhauling. The Jumo 004B engines in the German Me-262, 2 decades earlier, had required overhaul after 25 hours. The R-15 engines in the MiG-25 required overhaul after approximately 25 hours of flight time. Jet metallurgy had advanced enormously in 20 years. The demands placed on these engines had advanced further. Then the radar. This was perhaps the most significant surprise. Western analysts examining the capabilities the MiG-25 was supposed to possess had assumed sophisticated solid-state electronics, transistors, integrated circuits, modern avionics comparable to what American aircraft carried. The Foxbat's radar, designated the RP-25 Smerch-A and codenamed Foxfire by NATO, operated on vacuum tube technology. Not modern vacuum tubes, tubes of the type that had been considered obsolete in Western aviation since the mid-1950s. The avionics bays were crammed with nuvistors, a miniaturized form of vacuum tube technology that the Soviet electronics industry had continued producing long after Western manufacturers had abandoned them for semiconductors. American engineers were initially condescending. Then they ran the numbers on what that radar could actually do. The Foxfire generated approximately 600 kilowatts of radar power. The F-15's AN/APG-63 radar, one of the most sophisticated Western fire control radars of the era, generated under 5 kilowatts. The power differential was staggering, more than 100 to 1. A radar that powerful could burn straight through electronic jamming that would have blinded any American aircraft. The vacuum tubes, it turned out, had a practical military advantage. They were almost entirely immune to electromagnetic pulse from nuclear detonation. The MiG-25 had been designed to operate in a nuclear environment, where solid-state electronics would be destroyed and vacuum tube avionics would keep functioning. The radar had a critical weakness, however. It had no look-down, shoot-down capability. It could not distinguish a target flying below it against the ground clutter of the Earth's surface. An American aircraft that could maneuver below the MiG-25 and fly low was almost invisible to its weapon system. The 4 enormous R-40 Acrid missiles hanging from the Foxbat's wing pylons, each weighing over 500 kilograms, were designed for one purpose: killing large, slow, high-altitude bombers. Against a fast, maneuverable fighter at low altitude, the entire weapon system was largely useless. The picture that emerged was of an aircraft of extraordinary performance in a very narrow operational envelope. Fast, high, straight line, bomber killer, nothing else. The CIA's threat assessment had been wrong. The Foxbat was not a superfighter. It was a highly specialized interceptor built around a specific threat, the American B-70 Valkyrie and its escorts, that had never entered service. The intelligence failure around the MiG-25 was not merely a matter of misreading technical data. It was a structural failure driven by the fundamental asymmetry of the Cold War intelligence problem. The Soviet Union knew what its aircraft could and could not do. The United States did not. In that gap, worst-case assumptions drove planning. Every unknown parameter was resolved in favor of the most threatening interpretation. An aircraft that appeared fast was assumed to be fast. An aircraft photographed at altitude was assumed to be capable of altitude. Performance claims made at Soviet air shows, carefully choreographed to impress and intimidate, were taken at face value because no alternative data existed to contradict them. The Soviet military understood this dynamic and exploited it. The aircraft shown to Western observers at Moscow in 1967 were pre-production prototypes flown at carefully controlled speeds and altitudes that showcased the aircraft's appearance while revealing nothing about its operational limitations. The speed records set by MiG-25 variants in the late 1960s and early 1970s, some of which still stand, were achieved by specially prepared aircraft operating at conditions far beyond normal operational parameters, with engines that were destroyed in the process. They were propaganda flights dressed as aeronautical achievement. The damage done by this manufactured mystique was real and lasting. The F-15 program, originally scoped to defeat the MiG-21, had its requirements radically escalated to counter a threat that did not actually exist in the form intelligence described. The resulting aircraft, larger, heavier, more expensive, absorbed billions of additional development dollars and years of additional engineering time. The F-15 Eagle that emerged was extraordinarily capable, arguably the finest air superiority fighter of its generation. But it was designed to defeat a paper tiger that turned out to be a steel bull with no teeth for the job it was supposed to do. Adolf Galland, the German ace, had called the Me-262 the angel pushing. American pilots who evaluated, captured, and surrendered MiG-25s after the Cold War described something more earthbound: fast in a straight line, heavy on the controls, structurally limited to maneuvers a modern fighter pilot would consider barely aerobatic. The maximum G-loading that would rip missiles from the underwing pylons was achievable in a moderate turn. Belenko himself provided some of the most illuminating commentary. He confirmed that the aircraft was respected by its pilots for exactly what it could do. At high altitude, in a straight intercept profile against a large non-maneuvering target, nothing in the world was its equal. The SR-71 was faster and higher, and Soviet pilots knew it. Belenko described blackbirds flying just outside Soviet airspace, monitoring, probing, circling at altitudes the MiG-25 could not quite reach. The Foxbat could get close. It could not catch it. Against anything else, the limitations were severe. Range was marginal. The aircraft consumed fuel so rapidly that missions were planned to the minute, with runways kept clear for emergency landings, because a MiG-25 returning from a mission sometimes had fuel for one approach and no more. There was no in-flight refueling capability. A pilot who overshot had nowhere to go. The Soviets, for their part, were acutely aware of the damage Belenko's defection had done. Within months of the aircraft's return from Japan, examined, measured, photographed, and returned in 30 crates with 20 components missing, they began developing a replacement. The MiG-25 PD, with improved radar incorporating limited look-down capability and updated electronics, entered service in 1979. The deeper successor, the MiG-31 Foxhound, corrected nearly every fundamental limitation of the Foxbat. It had true look-down, shoot-down capability, vastly improved range, multi-target engagement, and the ability to operate cooperatively in groups. The West had been shown the rough draft of Soviet interceptor thinking. The Foxbat's secrets, once taken apart at Hayakuri, had told the Soviets exactly what needed fixing. The MiG-25 Foxbat remained in service with various air forces for decades after the Cold War. In the hands of the Iraqi Air Force during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, it demonstrated something Western analysts had underestimated. As a reconnaissance platform, it was genuinely superb. Flying at high altitude and high speed, it could sweep across a target area and return with photographic intelligence before any defense could be organized. Iraqi MiG-25s flew reconnaissance missions over Tehran during the war that the Iranian Air Force was entirely unable to prevent. Speed and altitude, deployed correctly, remained invulnerable. Against the coalition air forces during the Gulf War of 1991, Iraqi Foxbats faced a different problem. The F-15S and F-14S and AWACS aircraft arrayed against them represented exactly the networked, sophisticated opponent the MiG-25 had never been designed to fight. Most Iraqi MiG-25s were grounded, buried in sand, or destroyed on the runway. One Iraqi pilot, in one of the most remarkable individual actions of the conflict, fired an R-60 missile at an American F-15C during the Samara air battle on January 30th, 1991. Whether the missile connected and what damage it caused remains disputed to this day, but the engagement demonstrated that even an obsolete airframe in the hands of a skilled and aggressive pilot carried risk. The aircraft's final contribution to aviation history came not from what it could do, but from what it revealed. Belenko's defection was one of the most consequential intelligence events of the Cold War, not because of what was learned about a single aircraft, but because of what it demonstrated about the entire process of technical intelligence assessment. The MiG-25 had been a mirror in which the West saw its own fears reflected back and magnified. The lesson, that worst-case assumptions about unknown adversary capabilities will reliably produce overestimates that cost enormous sums to counter, has been relearned in every generation since. The aircraft itself became an archetype. When a new Soviet aircraft appeared during the Cold War, the immediate question was always, is this another Foxbat situation, or is this the real thing? The MiG-25 had taught the intelligence community to be skeptical of performance claims, to demand evidence, to look for the construction compromises that every aircraft makes. It was a harder, more rigorous standard, and it came directly from the embarrassment of having been wrong for 9 years. Belenko died in the United States in September 2023, age 76, having spent nearly 50 years living under an assumed identity he had guarded carefully. He gave almost no interviews in his lifetime and feared Soviet, and later Russian, retaliation until the day he died. His autobiography, written with Reader's Digest journalist John Barron and published in 1980, remained one of the definitive insider accounts of Soviet military aviation. The aircraft he flew to Japan sat in pieces at Hayakuri for 2 months. Then it was crated and sent home. The Soviet experts who inspected the crates at Vladivostok found 20 components missing. The Americans had kept what they needed and returned the rest. A polite theft at the end of a very cold war. The F-15 Eagle, designed to defeat a threat that turned out to be exaggerated, went on to compile 104 air-to-air victories against 0 losses in combat, a record no other fighter aircraft in history has matched. The paper tiger the Foxbat never was had produced the most capable air superiority fighter the world had seen. Sometimes fear builds better weapons than knowledge.